I want to welcome all of you to the UCLA Pritzker Center's 2021 Summer Child Welfare Academy. Before we begin, I will go through a bunch of logistics, so please bear with me, and then I'll get into the more exciting content. We are recording these sessions. The recording will be posted at the end of the Academy on our YouTube account. The Academy will begin at 1 o'clock each day. Please sign on and ensure you are ready to go. All of you are on mute. If you need something, please feel free to raise your hand or utilize the chat. We also welcome you to keep your cameras on and again, to utilize the chat and engage with one another there. Periodically, we may call on students to generate participation or invite feedback, but we definitely don't want to put anybody on the spot or make anybody feel uncomfortable. So always feel free to decline if you're not ready to speak. And we totally understand this is intended to be a fun and engaging experience and not feel super stressful. Again, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat and Brittany will be helping me with that. A lot of you have asked about the certificate of completion. So your Zoom name should match the name on the confirmation form. This is how we track attendance. And we also track attendance with a secret word that we will give at some point in the talk. So I'll be like, now I'm going to give the secret word. You're going to hear what it is. Brittany's going to put a link in the chat, and then you can click the link and put your name, your email, and the secret word. And that's how we'll track attendance, again, for the certificate. And we recognize that some of you might have conflicts and want to watch the video at a later time. Unfortunately, we only provide the certificate of completion to students who join us for the live sessions. So I just want to flag for everybody. I'm sure this is well known and probably understood, but the content and discussion in this course necessarily engages with topics around racism, child abuse, including physical, sexual, and emotional abuse, as well as issues relating to disparity, trauma, family dynamics, poverty, loss, injustice, and inequity. Much of it will be emotionally and intellectually challenging to engage with. However, we will do our best to make this Zoom classroom a space where we can engage bravely, empathetically, and thoughtfully with difficult content every week. You are welcome to contact me with specific concerns should you wish to avoid or discuss a topic further. I think everyone's probably seen the syllabus by now, so you have a gist for what we'll talk about. I will say that based on last year's feedback, the health presentation by Dr. Claudia Wong was probably the most sensitive for students. So if you have questions about that, or you feel like it might be something that you want to dive in a little bit deeper in terms of what she'll present, let me know and you can come to office hours and we can talk about it. Okay. We really want to make sure everybody's comfortable with the content. I also want to acknowledge these tremendous times that we're living in due to the COVID-19 pandemic. We know it's impacted everyone in numerous personal and professional ways. And we're sorry, so sorry for the devastating impact and losses that so many people have accrued during this time. I also want to acknowledge that we're committed at the UCLA Pritzker Center to advancing equity and dismantling the harms facing Black children and families in particular, and people of color. We stand with these communities in solidarity, and we thank all of you for joining us for the Summer Academy and for participating in these discussions toward reducing and ending these inequities. Finally, though we are currently online at UCLA, we acknowledge our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino and Tongva peoples. We take this acknowledgement very seriously, especially given the historical and ongoing harm experienced by Native people within the child welfare system. In light of this acknowledgement, I want to share a brief film. One moment, please.
Would you like to come up to the witness stand?
They went into my home and picked up my children. and placed them in a foster home.
This country had official policy to remove Native children from their homes and place them with white families so that they would learn how to be white.
But we're still here. And many of our people have never, ever shared their stories.
Imagine being torn away from your parents and community.
I remember the station wagon pulling up.
Never talks about it in therapy. I played video games.
Maine has become the first state in the nation to form a Truth and Reconciliation Commission focusing on child welfare.
The truth hurts. The truth is very painful.
How come it took so long for y'all to get a group together to see if they can help us? You can't heal someone that's going through hell.
Usually, when a truth commission happens, there's a great deal of unrest in the society that's surrounding it. And here, the dominant culture is largely unaware.
People are saying, no, this is not genocide. Genocide is what happened at Auschwitz.
The reality is, it's been the attack of our culture. It's been the attempt to remove our culture, and you replace it with nothing.
What happened to my aunts, my grandparents, and all that still happened.
Tell me about your employment in state child welfare.
The judges didn't figure this was anything we had to do much about.
For the longest time, I was really afraid to even say that I was Indian.
You don't take 500 years of mistrust and wash it away with one commission.
I'm not sure where we're going to be able to gain your trust.
By all intents and purposes, you represent the perpetrator. White privilege is not something I can get rid of. I think my obligation is to harness it.
Holy Michigan.
I would have thought the state of Maine would ever engage the Wabanaki and the Slavic. We see it as something very deep, a necessary transition from being an occupier to being a neighbor.
Thank you so much for watching that brief film. I'm sure as many of you saw, there's a deep connection between like I said, the Native American community and the historical harms that the child welfare system has inflicted upon it. We will be discussing some of those topics later in the Academy, but for today, just wanted to kick off our session with a brief film. That film is called Dawnland, for those of you who might be interested in watching it further. Want to pause just 1 second and check on one thing, if you'll just. All right, so we have some special guests joining us today, and I'm going to introduce them right after I introduce myself, and Brittany introduces herself. Then we'll introduce David Noble, and we also have Leslie Gilbert-Lurie joining us, I see. So happy to have you here. Thank you for being with us. And we'll start now with those introductions. So again, welcome everybody. My name is Taylor Dudley, and I'm the Administrative Director for the UCLA Pritzker Center. My email is in the chat, Brittany, if you don't mind just putting it in there just for everybody, just in case. You're welcome to contact me anytime. I have been involved with the child welfare system for over 15 years. I'm a California attorney and I specialize in this field, and it's really my privilege and my honor to be with you here throughout our summer academy. I actually started working in this field when I was 17. I've really taken a strong appreciation for the foster care system ever since I was introduced to it and decided to make a career out of working within it. I've represented many children in dependency matters. I've lobbied and written and implemented federal and state and local policy, and taught and supervised a number of students over the years. But more importantly than any of those professional qualifications is really the inspiration and the joy that I experience working with the kids and families, and more importantly, experience a real sense of learning when it comes to engaging with the children and families in the child welfare system. In my experience, they have universal lessons of hope and healing to offer all of us. And I really want to dedicate our work and our experience here to the kids and families that we aim to serve through our work. So with that being said, it's really my privilege to lead us through this experience. And we really want to welcome all of you and hope that you find it to be an informative and inspiring program. I am now pleased to introduce Brittany. Brittany's our student assistant. She'll tell you a little bit about herself.
All right. Hi, good to see everyone. Thank you for joining us for our second summer academy. My name is Brittany Hun. I am an incoming third year undergraduate studying human biology and society. So I've been working at the Pritzker Center for about a little over a year now. I kind of wear a few different hats, but mostly I'm on the coordinating side and kind of just like on the Zoom event, kind of getting that together. I've just really always had a passion for children and families. I think that's something that's always something I wanted to do with my career. So kind of on like the pre-med track, but also like looking into social work myself. So I honestly think this academy is a really cool opportunity to kind of learn about the system in LA County and like kind of the different things that are going on like around us. And so I think it's a cool opportunity to kind of explore career paths and just learn more. So I'm excited. And I'm here for you guys, whatever you need. I'm gonna put my email in the chat. So feel free to email me or just DM me if any issues come up. So, thank you.
Brittany, thank you so much. And next, I'm really excited to introduce a special guest that we have joining us, Leslie Gilbert-Lurie. Leslie, hi, thanks so much for being with us. Leslie is a proud alumna of UCLA, having graduated from UCLA in 1981, as well as from the law school in 1984. Leslie has been historically involved with UCLA in a number of ways, currently serving on the board of advisors to the Ronald Reagan UCLA Medical Center, as well as to the law school. And she is also a member of the UCLA Foundation Board of Directors. And even more than her UCLA involvement is all of her community involvement. Leslie was a founding board member of the Alliance for Children's Rights and continues to serve the Alliance for Children's Rights as previously as chair of the board and as a member of the board today. And Leslie was also on the LA County Blue Ribbon Commission for child welfare, which really advanced a lot of change and important policy initiatives in LA County. So we're really happy to have her. Leslie, I'm not sure if you want to say a few words to our students, but we're really grateful to have your presence here today.
Well, I'm really grateful to be here. And I would just say that I met Taylor at the Alliance for Children's Rights initially, and I am so inspired by all the work you're doing at the Pritzker Center and all you're doing to move the antiquated child welfare world forward. So thank you for inviting me.
Of course. Well, thank you for being here. It means so much to me. You've been such a steadfast supporter of the center from day one, and we're so thankful to have you, especially at this first session. And we really want to welcome you and thank you for your tremendous service, not only to UCLA, but to the child welfare system. It's such a great example to me and to our students. So thank you for representing that today.
Thank you.
I'm also really excited and honored to introduce my co-presenter today, David Noble. David, thank you so much for being here. David, I'm not sure if you would like to introduce yourself, but I'm really thankful to have you from the Alliance for Children's Rights with us today. Thank you.
Thanks for the introduction, Taylor, and also for inviting me to be part of this really amazing summer academy. As Taylor said, I am a policy associate with the Alliance for Children's Rights. Wouldn't be here without Leslie, who was one of the founding board members of the Alliance. And I'm going to talk more about some of my work later. So for right now, I'll just say that I'm really glad to be here, and I've really enjoyed working with the Pritzker Center over the course of my time with the Alliance.
Awesome. Thank you so much, David. We all have so much to learn from you, and I'm so happy that you're here. All right, so again, more importantly, we want to welcome our students. We couldn't be here without you. You all have shown so much commitment, so much dedication to show up, be here, to commit your summer to learning about this. We can't thank you enough. We are really excited to say that we have students from every level at UCLA. We have PhD students, we have law students, we have MPP, MSW, we have students from every undergraduate major represented, whether it be the sciences or the arts. We are so happy to see this interest in child welfare. And as I will share with you in a few minutes, that's really the purpose of the UCLA Pritzker Center. We're here because we want to bring professionals from every level and from every discipline together around our kids and around our families to support them in more meaningful ways. So whether you want to be a teacher or you want to be a doctor or you want to be a lawyer or a nurse or you want to be a filmmaker, we need you in this work and we're so honored to have you. So thank you for coming. And with that, we want to give you a moment to introduce yourselves to one another. So we're going to put us into some breakout rooms for about 2 to 3 minutes. It's going to be pretty quick. But when you go in there, feel free to share your name, your pronouns if you wish, your program, and why you applied to join the Academy. I'll put that in the chat in case anyone needs a refresher, but we're just going to do a quick little breakout and get to know each other so that we feel a little bit more connected and acquainted. Okay, so with that, let's do breakout rooms. See you shortly. We'll be back in a minute. Thanks, Brittany. I want to start by telling you a little bit about the UCLA Pritzker Center. So I'm going to put up some slides and we will discuss those. Pardon my screens. This is my least favorite part of Zoom. So the UCLA Pritzker Center was started a few years ago at UCLA. We are now entering our 4th year, and we are here on campus to connect a variety of fields from education, law and policy, medicine, public health, mental health, social work, and many more to come together around prevention strategies to reduce the need for foster care while creating reforms within the child welfare system. The center's faculty include Dr. Tyrone Howard, Dr. Audra Langley as the center's directors, as well as Dr. Todd Franke and Dr. Patricia Lester, both of whom, well, Todd is affiliated with Luskin and Dr. Lester is affiliated with the School of Medicine. Together, we do our work in 3 primary ways. We do a lot of education and training, this being an example of that. We support various research and evaluation efforts. And one of our biggest goals is to partner with individuals, organizations, and entities, both on campus and across the community of LA County. That piece of our work will be demonstrated throughout the Summer Academy. As you observe, we have partners joining us from organizations as well as UCLA to help us deliver this information to you. It's really our hope that you'll be able to see faculty that you could take classes with or community organizations that you could go on and do internships, volunteer with, or maybe even one day work for. So we hope that by bringing together both the campus and the community, it will help you see all of the variety of opportunities that exist in this field. With that, I'm going to go over our syllabus. So just one second while I switch screens. It's again, my least favorite part of Zoom. I'm never quite sure I'm doing it right. Okay. All right, so there's our syllabus. I'm sure many of you have had a moment to take a look at it. The syllabus outlines a couple of important things. The first being the Zoom link here on the top. That's available to you to use throughout the Academy. We'll have that same Zoom link. We also have office hours on July 14th, July 21st, July 28th from 3 to 4 p.m. These are completely voluntary. Brittany and I will be there just to welcome students, talk with you, go over any questions. Last year, we had several students join to just learn more about the center. Some of those students actually came to work for the center over the academic year as researchers and as student assistants. So if that's of interest to you, feel free to come see us in office hours. If you have questions about content or you're concerned about some of the issues that we'll be discussing, again, just come see us anytime. If the office hours don't work for your schedule, feel free to reach out and we'll find another time to meet. The syllabus itself goes over all of the different speakers that will be joining us, and we've included some links to various content that might be of interest to you throughout the session. It's not required, but it might give you like a little background that could be helpful before you come and listen to the session. As you can see, we will be covering a variety of topics. Today, we're doing an introduction and an overview with a special emphasis on the racial disparities involved in the child welfare system. Next week, we have Dr. Audra Langley. She'll be speaking about mental health and well-being in the child welfare system. On the 15th, we have Dr. Claudia Wong, She's a physician at UCLA and specializes in child abuse and neglect. She'll be giving a presentation on how child abuse is investigated, medically speaking, and how children in foster care are treated and the type of medical care that they receive throughout their time in foster care to help them heal. On the 20th, we have Dr. Tyrone Howard and Jill Rowland with the Alliance for Children's Rights. They will be speaking about the educational needs of children in foster care. On July 22nd, we have, it's a 4-topic session. We're going to hit 4 really key and critical issues that come up in the foster care system. The first being around adoption. Cynthia Billy with the Alliance for Children's Rights will give that talk. Jennifer Padilla of UCLA Bruin and current UCLA Bruin Guardian Scholars employee will speak about the issues impacting older youth, known as transition age youth, in the foster care system. Ariel Bustamante will speak with us from the LGBT Center about the LGBTQ issues that come up among young people in care. They're very prevalent, and we really want to make sure that everybody walks away with a strong understanding of that. And then finally, we have Andrea Ramos from Southwestern Law School joining us. She specializes in the intersection between the foster care system and immigration. There's some really critical issues that come up there, and we're really excited to welcome her to the Academy this year. On the 27th, Sue Abrams with Children's Law Center will join us. She will be giving us a talk about the policymaking process in the child welfare system. So she'll talk about federal, state, and local policymaking and how those policies that impact our kids and our families are formed, and how we as advocates and as students can get involved in the policymaking process. And then lastly, we have our career panel. We extended it this year. Last year, it was only an hour. We've extended it to 2 hours because students really enjoyed it, and we wanted to give you all more time to engage. We have Danielle Rivera. She's a social worker from DCFS joining us. Stacy Barron. She's the medical director for DCFS and a pediatrician. And my apologies, DCFS stands for Department of Children and Family Services. That's the child welfare agency run by the LA County government here in Los Angeles. We have Sophie De Figueredo. She is with the DMH UCLA Prevention Center of Excellence and has done a lot of work around mental health, specifically for children in foster care. She's a therapist and can speak to her work in the mental health community, serving kids that have experienced child abuse and neglect. We have Rachel Ewing joining us, and Rachel's actually here today. Rachel, I don't know if you want to say a quick hello, but you're welcome to do so if you're still with us.
I'm here, and hello, everybody. I look forward to seeing you all on the 29th and recruiting you. No.
Thanks, Rachel. So Rachel is an amazing attorney with the LA Dependency Lawyers. She directs one of the firms there and is also the head of the Los Angeles Dependency Lawyers Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion efforts. Rachel is so engaging. We love her to death, and she's going to be with us again on the 29th to talk about serving as parents counsel for children in foster care. We have Laura Alonji with UCLA Luskin. She oversees the social work program for those of you interested in becoming social workers, and may have a lot to say about how to become a DCFS social worker, the schooling involved. And lastly, we have Dean Conklin with Children's Law Center. He's an attorney there, and will speak about representing children specifically in the foster care system. So this is our syllabus. We are so excited to offer this to all of you. It's a jam-packed few weeks, but we trust that you will leave having learned so much. With that, I'm going to close out the syllabus and pull up my slides to get into the content. Okay, so we've gone over a lot of logistics, and if you have any questions, again, feel free to raise your hand, put a note in the chat, reach out to me, reach out to Brittany. We're here for you, and we really want to make sure you have everything that you need from a logistical standpoint. And as we move into this discussion about the child welfare system, I want to acknowledge that this is a very nuanced system. We are talking in very broad strokes throughout the academy. The content that we will discuss is largely going to be based on California and the LA County child welfare system. But please understand that foster care, the child welfare system, it exists throughout the country and in many different iterations from state to state and from local county to local county. So it can vary depending on where you go. And for those of you with lived experience, some of what I say might sound a little different from how you experienced it. And we really want to make space for that and acknowledge that what you might have experienced or what you might know is exactly how it happened for you. And yet it might have happened differently here in LA County, or it might have happened differently for someone else. Okay, so again, really broad strokes as we work through this process and through sharing it, but please know we also want to make space for the variations that you might have experienced elsewhere. Okay. I also want to acknowledge that I'm explaining how the system works, and I say that in air quotes because in many ways I'm not saying that it actually works, and I'm not saying that this is the way it should be. We're explaining it to you in really an objective way, and we're asking you to think critically, to help find the flaws, and to help think about solutions that would make it better. We acknowledge, as we have throughout the presentation so far, that much of the system is rooted in really historical issues around racism, disparity, and inequity. We see those disparities coming to life every day in this system. David's going to talk about them a little bit more. I'll highlight them too, but we want to acknowledge this system needs a lot of work. It needs bright, young, talented people like all of you to come to it and to try and help make it better. And we definitely don't give this talk and suggest that the way that I'm saying it is the way that it should be, or the way that it's actually working for kids and families. In many ways, it is not. So with that, what is the child welfare system? I keep talking about it and like using this term, and you might be like, what is she talking about? So the child welfare system here in LA County is one of the largest systems in the world. We have about, at present, 21,000 children that are in out-of-home placement. So that means 21,000 kids who are living with somebody other than a biological parent due to a finding of abuse or neglect. So these are kids that have gone through a court process and the court has decided that they should be living with someone other than the biological parent. 34,000 children are receiving some type of services from the LA County Child Welfare System. So this means that mom and dad or mom and mom or somebody might be going to a class or getting therapy or getting some type of service to help them be a more suitable or more appropriate parent for their children. Sometimes families voluntarily receive these services, and sometimes they are required to do so in order to avoid removal of their children from their homes. Again, these numbers, they represent the largest system in the world. That's not a fact that I say proudly. This means that here in LA County, we have the biggest system, which means we have the most kids that are experiencing these hardships of being away from their parents or experiencing some type of abuse or neglect. The LA County Child Welfare System currently operates with a budget of about $2 billion. And I hope you all heard me say the billion part of that number. That's a pretty significant budget. And a lot of people and a lot of our students will say, couldn't we do more with that money? Couldn't we do something different with that money? Isn't there a way to help families living in poverty avoid foster care by providing them with these funds rather than putting them in foster care? So those are some of the questions that we'll grapple with throughout the academy. The LA County Department of Children and Family Services has about 9,000 employees. Again, so if you're thinking about being a social worker or you think about wanting to work within the system itself, you'd be working within a very large organization. Again, about 9,000 employees. There's a number of public and private partners that I'll talk about shortly that comprise this system and this work. Specifically government agencies, as well as a number of nonprofits, many of which are represented in our academy roster of speakers. As I mentioned, this is a very collaborative system. Public agencies, including mental health, health services, social services, public health, the courts, even the libraries, all comprise this system. Schools, if you're interested in being a teacher, if you're interested in working with students, big piece of the child welfare system. Many schools, especially those that serve underserved communities, actually have programs specifically for children in foster care. There are a lot of efforts at the LA Unified School District specifically directed at kids in foster care. Jill Rowland will talk more about that in a couple of weeks when she speaks about education. And a lot of that's due to advocacy that organizations like Alliance for Children's Rights have engaged in to help kids in foster care get a better education. I also want to acknowledge the overlap between the juvenile justice system and the child welfare system. I'll talk briefly about that at the end of my talk today. And of course, as we acknowledged at the top of the presentation, tribes, Native American communities have a big role in the child welfare system, specifically when it comes to the removal of children from their families and where they should be placed while they're in foster care. Also, our private partners, foster family agencies, nonprofits, legal aid, philanthropy, faith-based groups, all have a big role in this system. So very collaborative, again, a lot of opportunities to get involved. Any one of these places needs interns, people to work for them. And we hope to give you some exposure to that throughout the academy. So when we talk about child welfare and what it is, how it works, one of the things that we talk about the most is prevention. How do you keep kids from actually coming to be involved in the system in the first place? How do you keep families from becoming involved? Some of these efforts are directed at schools. They're coming out of public health. They're coming out of doctors' offices. And they're really efforts directed at the general population to attempt to stop maltreatment, being child abuse or neglect, before it happens. So can we get a little action in the chat to talk about what kind of examples you can think of that might be efforts or activities that could help stop maltreatment before it starts? I'll give you guys a second to put things in the chat. Great. Parenting programs, food pantries, sex education, parent support groups, community programs that concentrate on education and parenting, counseling services. Exactly. Anything else? Child tax credit. Great. Childcare, info from pediatricians for families. Absolutely. Anything else? Parental leave. Absolutely. Yeah. Stable housing. Love that. Thanks for raising the importance of that. Anything else? Okay, so you guys did a great job at touching on the variety of things that are needed for families to be stable and for families to be supported. So much of that comes from, how do families experience their communities? Do they have stable housing? Is there violence in their community? Do they have a place to turn for help? Can they get mental health services if needed? What happens when they get pregnant? Can they access prenatal care in a really supportive and encouraging way? After the baby's here, can they take parental leave? Can they get childcare? Can they get a home visitor? Can they get a nurse to visit? All of these things go toward preventing and ending maltreatment before it starts. And a lot of our public health colleagues will talk about these efforts in great detail and have a lot to say about it. More importantly, we also think about things not just at the community level, but at a much more macro level. So somebody mentioned child tax credit. Somebody mentioned, bigger efforts that take place at like a federal level, if you will, to help address the stability of families while they're caring for children. So again, really great examples that you all gave around prevention. Another piece of prevention, and this is going to be something that I think David will probably talk about, is how we engage with families of color, specifically how they are over surveilled, over penalized, over prosecuted, over represented in our foster care system. And we can see how a lot of these primary prevention efforts are specifically needed among communities that have been historically underserved. And yet interacting with some of these systems might actually result in their involvement in the child welfare system inadvertently. And we'll talk about why that is shortly. So we're now going to run through the system's response to child abuse and neglect. As I've mentioned, this is a very nuanced process. I've taught an entire course about this 8-step process over an entire semester. So that's weeks and weeks. I'm about to do it in about 10 or 15 minutes. So this is going to be a very truncated version of how the system responds to child abuse and neglect. And again, as we talk about it, I think you'll see that there's a lot of holes. There's a lot of areas that really need to be improved upon. And a lot of these issues, again, overlap pretty significantly with racism and historical over surveillance of children and families of color. Okay. So the very first thing that happens when a family becomes involved with the child welfare system is this idea of a reasonable suspicion of child abuse or neglect. If we can, again, interact with the chat, I'd love to see some ideas around what might happen that would give somebody a reasonable suspicion of child abuse or neglect. Let's get in the chat. Bruises, marks, bruising, disclosure from a child, physical harm, injury, weight loss, child's afraid to go home, flinching, dirty clothes, not attending school, really quiet, behavioral changes. Yeah, exactly. So you can see the range, right? Social detachment. Some of you are writing things that are maybe about behavior. Some of you are writing things that are actually about the way the child looks, whether it be their appearance, whether it be injuries. Some of you are speaking to like very common things that happen among kids, like they're sick or maybe they're sleeping in class. But all of these things might make us go, I hope this child is okay. Where are these concerns coming up? Like specifically what environment? Can we put some of those ideas into the chat? In school, yeah, a lot of you are saying these things are coming up in school, a daycare center, a therapy, yep, hospitals, doctor's offices, friends' houses, after school programs, exactly. So again, you see something, you're like, I'm not sure what's going on with this child. Are they okay? And maybe I'm a teacher, maybe I'm a nurse, maybe I'm a pastor. But if I have these concerns, I, as a person with that concern, can pick up the phone and make a call to the child abuse hotline. This is a 1-800 number that pretty much anybody can call at any time. Question for you guys is, are some people required to make calls? Or are some, yes. So you guys are saying yes, mandatory reporters, exactly. So some of the examples that you gave in the chat were around, teachers calling. Teachers are mandatory reporters. Nurses are mandatory reporters. There's a big long list of people who are mandatory reporters. And this is all in the California Penal Code that requires people who suspect child abuse and neglect to pick up the phone and make a call. Okay. Now, some of you wrote in the chat, things like dirty clothes, sleeping in class, aggressive behavior, detachment. Those might be reasons that we're going to pick up the phone and call the child abuse hotline. But I'm going to challenge that idea. What are other things that we could do before we equate dirty clothes with calling the child abuse hotline? Any other things we can do? Talk with the parents, speak with the child, have a conversation. Exactly, talk to the family. Right. So that's an important consideration. And I raise it because there are naturally a number of children that simply lack the resources to show up to school every day in clothes that have been freshly laundered. There are children that might live in communities where even though the parents are doing their very best, there's a lot of noise and there's a lot of, action happening all night, and that keeps them awake. So does that automatically mean child abuse? Probably not, maybe, but we need to get more information. And those can be really important considerations, especially when it comes to working with and being involved with children and families that are in underserved communities. And so we really want to highlight how important that is. when it comes to making these calls about the reasonable suspicion of child abuse and neglect. So again, to summarize, we're talking about mandatory reporters picking up the phone, making a call because of all those reasons described. And then that prompts an investigation, okay? I also just want to flag that a person who's not a mandatory reporter can also call. And I may be a mandatory reporter from 9 to 5 because I, a teacher at school. And then I go home at night and my neighbor has something going on. And now I'm concerned and I can call then too, but it wouldn't be as a mandatory reporter, okay? So once that call is made, an investigation is prompted, okay? And I'm gonna show you guys a short video to outline how those investigations work, okay? One moment, please. I want to note that
Look at this.
I want to note that this video comes from Minnesota, but the investigation process is very similar, okay?
94% of people believe company culture is important to an organization's success.
The most obsolete idea is go to school, get a job, work hard, save money, get out of debt, and invest for the long term in the stock market. So why would you save money when they're
so sorry, one second. Is that working?
Was on emergency coverage. I got approached by intake. There was a 1-year-old who was at Masonic Hospital at the University of Minnesota Hospital with a skull fracture, presented with and this little one, or how she got the skull fracture. On top of having the acute fracture, it was also discovered when she went through a skeletal survey that she had an old healing fracture on her tibia. So a completely different injury, very serious again for a very young child, without any explanation for what had occurred to her. So the first thing that we always do when we get assigned a case is cross report to law enforcement. What that means is I take a copy of the initial report that I'm given by intake and I send it over to the law enforcement jurisdiction. So in this specific case, it was Burnsville. So I contacted the sergeant at Burnsville, said, this is what I've got. They assign it then to one of their investigators, and then we go forward teaming the case from there. So myself and the detective that was assigned the case connected, said, let's get up to the hospital right now. We knew the caregivers were there, mom and dad were there, and that's where we're going to start. So we went up to the hospital. We questioned both mom and dad separately at length about, tell me how you came to find this injury. The story was that the child had not been showing any discomfort, any pain, or anything of that nature. It was as simple as on a Sunday at church, mom had the little girl on her lap and had kind of been feeling her head and found a spot on her head that felt squishy and thought it was odd. When she pushed on the spot, child did not show any discomfort, did not cry out or anything like that. But she said, thought to herself, she's got a well child check. Just the next day, I'll bring it up to the physician at that time. So the child already had an appointment, a standing appointment with her pediatrician the next day. So mom decided, she doesn't seem to be in any pain right now. It doesn't seem like it's an emergency, but I'll bring it up to the doctor the next day. So that's what she did. She brought the child in for her well child check and brought it up to the physician. The physician said, okay, well, just to be safe, let's do an x-ray. So they actually did the x-ray and let mom and daughter go because they weren't going to get the results right away. Just I'll follow up with you when I get the results. So short time after, mom says that she was contacted by the pediatrician and said, you know what, actually we found a fracture. There's a skull fracture. What I want you to do is head up to Masonic so we can check this out further and treat her further for it. So mom contacted dad. They both brought the child up there. Mom and dad, both in their independent interviews, just described just being shocked, just shocked that she has this fracture, that they didn't know she was hurt, that she wasn't acting any differently. But then to go through the skeletal survey and then to learn further that there is another fracture that is there, that is healing. No idea time frame of when it could have occurred, but it's again another significant injury on a little one. So as we took mom and dad through those interviews, we questioned them extensively. We had them take us back over the previous week. So we went day by day with each of them over what was her routine, what was going on that day. Is there anything you can think of, any falls, any accidents, anything of that nature? We had nothing. Now, in talking to him, we learned that the other caregivers for this little one involve an at-home daycare, as well as a grandparent who takes care of her once a week. So we felt good just where we stood with the parents and how they presented. We felt good about letting the little one go home with them. I didn't have the sense that, somebody's not being forthcoming, or, the other piece of this was too, that the doctor we were working with and consulting on this presented us with, this could be abusive. It could also be accidental, but someone should know what caused this injury.
Okay. Any thoughts or feedback based on the video about investigation? Did anybody notice there was something that the social worker said about the family? She said it kind of toward the end in terms of her conversation with them and the information that they presented. Did anyone catch what she said? Yeah, it's right here. Thanks. I think it's Giovanni. Giovanni, can you speak more about what you wrote? They felt good about the parents.
Yeah, it seems like based on their intuition, from talking to the parents, they kind of got a good sense, but then it kind of reminded me of the whole Gabriel situation where they were kind of like, okay, well, we're just letting it slide. But I think that it should still go into further investigation.
Yeah, thank you so much. So Giovanni hit the nail on the head here. They're interviewing these parents, and some of you wrote about this in the chat. Like, it's pretty intense, right? They're asking them so many things, like, where was your child? How did this happen? Who's been caring for them? Where were they at this moment, at that moment, and in the next moment? Who was watching them? Back and forth, all trying to get to the bottom of how this happened. And then the social worker says, well, they presented well, so we let them go. We let them take the child home. And someone's talking about the parents seemed really forthcoming. But these are all the considerations that we have to make when we're investigating. Karen Yee is saying that it's hard that investigators are working on just intuition. Yeah, I mean, they're definitely like taking what they're getting from those conversations, and then they're also looking at the facts. I mean, here we have a social worker who very clearly said, she's talking to the doctor, and the doctor said, well, this could have happened accidentally, or it could have happened intentionally. Okay. And we'll hear Dr. Wong. She'll talk more about this with us in a couple of days, but examining these kids in a medical context is really important because it can shed a lot of light on how injuries happen. Okay. So Giovanni gives us a nice segue to talking to other people in the community. That's another part of the investigation. So, again, to walk us through our process, we have a call to the hotline. We're concerned about this kid. Somebody goes out and is seeing what's happening in the home. Somebody's talking to a doctor. Somebody's talking to the teacher. They're talking to the daycare. They're talking to the grandma, and they're trying to collect information about how this happened. Okay. And somebody else wrote into the chat that it makes them think about racial bias and how it can influence the vibes. I like that. A social worker can get from a parent. And I want to thank Olivia for putting that in the chat, because that's really what I was getting at when I said the parents presented well. Like, what does that mean? What does that mean to present well? It can mean a lot of things. I don't know what that worker meant by that, but these are all considerations that we really want to have in mind when we're thinking about how these investigations happen. Okay. I also want to acknowledge something that Rachel wrote in the chat around it could be an accident, but someone should know what happened, right? Well, I don't know about you, but sometimes things happen that you just can't explain. In this case, this child is changing hands throughout the day. they're at daycare, they're at, with the grandma, they're with the parents, they're with the mom, the dad, there might be other people in and out, and these things could have happened at any time. Okay. So again, that's the investigation. It's a pretty intensive process. And it can take place depending on the age of the child for a few days or up to an entire month. Okay. So imagine for an entire month, you're like, what's going to happen with my kid? What's going to happen? Are they going to stay in my care? Are they going to go into foster care? In some instances where the injuries or where the abuse or neglect is severe, or where the child is exposed perhaps to a lot of drugs or other circumstances that could be detrimental to their well-being, the child will actually be removed right away, okay, and placed elsewhere pretty quickly. In some cases, the child can stay while the investigation takes place, okay? Let's assume that the child, for the rest of our presentation here, let's assume that the child is removed, okay, and that they are now, with someone other than the biological parent. That could be a relative, that could be a non-relative. They could go into foster care with a non-relative. And in that instance, we use the term removal to describe what has happened. So they've been removed from their parents and they're now staying with someone else, okay? Because of that, the court process kicks on. And this is something that Rachel can speak to far better than I, but I'm going to just really briefly share with you that once the court process kicks on, the very first thing that we're trying to understand is whether the child should stay removed. Should they stay in this placement outside of the home of the biological parent, or should they go home? Okay. And wonderful attorneys like Rachel, and we're going to hear, later this in the session from a couple others, represent the children, represent the parents, and then represent the social worker. So there's 3 different attorneys, all representing different interests, speaking to this question about whether the child should be removed and remain out of the home, or whether the child should go home while the rest of this process takes place. Okay. Assuming that the court decides that the child should remain in foster care, there is a requirement that reunification services be offered, okay? Reunification services are required to address the reason for the child's removal, okay? So let's say, for instance, that a family is experiencing housing instability, issues relating to food access and insecurity, and there's also some concerns about sexual abuse happening in the home. The reunification services that the family receives should all address those 3 issues. So for instance, housing. How are we helping this family get into stable housing? How are we helping this family stabilize with respect to food access? And most importantly, how are we learning about safe and appropriate boundaries around sexual abuse so that it doesn't happen anymore, okay? So those reunification services will be offered to the family and are really designed or I should say are intended to help the family reunify and come back together after the child has been placed in foster care, okay? So that term, reunification, really specifically addresses the desire to bring families back together after they've been separated through the foster care system, okay? There are some instances, however, where reunification services are not offered, where it's not possible to reunify, and the court will decide that upfront. Those include really severe cases involving death of a sibling. They can include or involve really severe physical or sexual abuse. And again, these are situations where the court says outright, sorry, reunification is not possible here. It would be too detrimental to the children, okay? But by and large, the reunification services include things like therapy, classes, you know, support with getting a job, housing, etc. And some of those things that I'm talking about, right? Those are things that are relating to poverty. They have nothing to do with child abuse and limited connection to neglect. And yet those are the reasons that many of our kids are in care. Majority of them. People think that the foster care system is mostly comprised of children that have been horribly abused. But in fact, most of them are there because of poverty. And so should it be the case that they should be there in the first place? If the answer to that question is yes, what kind of services and what kind of support can we offer them to reconnect and do so quickly? So again, those are the reunification services, and those are required once the child has been removed. We could talk all day and all night about how difficult it is to access these services, the inconveniences that families face in getting to them. You could have a family living in East LA, and the only service that they can reasonably access or reasonably enroll for is in South LA. They got to take the bus. They've got to leave work early. They've got to find, you know, someone to help drive them. All these things, right, becomes very challenging and very punitive for our families to reunify. And yet so many of them successfully do so and work really, really hard so that they can reunite with their kids. And yet what we know, and this takes us to our next juncture in the system, which is reentering foster care. We know that about 50% of children will go home and reunify with their parents. And of that 50% will come right back in. Oftentimes they come back in for the same reasons. They come back in because they show up again at school, having not been fed, having been up all night, misbehaving, wearing dirty clothes, and, you know, looking to be in bad shape. They re-enter the system again. Okay. And again, those same services will be offered, the same hopes around reconnecting the families will be there. And of those kids, some of them will go back home and they'll stay there, and some of them will stay in foster care and go through the next process, which is known as, quote, permanency. Okay. Permanency speaks to two different arrangements. The first being legal guardianship, and the second being adoption. Both of these options are intended to stabilize families, stabilize children so that they have permanent and lasting caregivers, so that they are not entering and re-entering the foster care system. We know, however, that for children of color, and specifically Black children, that it is especially difficult as they age to find permanent placements. So children as young as 8 years old will sometimes experience a difficult time finding an adoptive home simply because they're a child of color. That's why those reunification services that I talked about are incredibly important, and even more upstream, why that prevention is so important, why that investigation has to be accurate, because the long-term effects that this removal will have on the child can follow them throughout their lives. Okay. The last piece I want to mention in this process is around extended foster care. Here in California, young people can remain in foster care until age 21. So for those who did not find permanency, who remained in foster care, they can stay until they're 21 with additional supports and services. Okay. So I've run through this very quickly. Again, this process itself can take anywhere between 12 to 24 months. So you can imagine that in a 2-year period, there's a lot going on, and that I did not do any justice to explaining it in the fast manner that I did. But we really just wanted you to have the basics around picking up the phone, having a suspicion of abuse or neglect, going through the investigation, offering the reunification services to try and reconnect the family, what that permanency arrangement looks like, and for those kids who don't find it, how they can end up in extended foster care until age 21. Okay. We are getting short on time, so I'm going to just wrap it up briefly with a couple of points. I want to, I'm looking at the chat. I really want to acknowledge, so Monique asked us, about disability playing into this. We will hear quite a bit about disabilities and the unique needs of children in foster care throughout the session. Throughout the academy. So Dr. Langley will speak to that when she talks about mental health and some of the issues that come up there. We'll hear about it a lot when Dr. Howard and Jill Rowland give their talk on education and some of the services that kids experience in the educational environment. And Dr. Wong will talk about it too, because it comes up a lot with respect to evaluating child abuse and neglect. Sometimes kids are nonverbal and they can't tell you what happened. Sometimes they won't tell you what happened. Sometimes they are disabled and they are more vulnerable to abuse or neglect. And sometimes their parents may actually be disabled. And that can be an intellectual disability, that can be a physical disability that impairs their ability to parent in a way that is safe for the child. And I'm sure that Rachel and our other colleagues can speak to those types of issues and how they come up in court and the expectations and standards that we apply that may not be appropriate for those parents. Okay, so I want to thank Monique for raising that, because it's a huge issue that comes up really for all sides at every juncture in the system. Okay, so crossover youth, I want to acknowledge our children who are simultaneously involved in foster care and the juvenile justice system. 2/3 of justice-involved youth have had contact with the child welfare system. So that means that, when we're talking about kids who are currently incarcerated or kids who are on probation, a good number of them were children that are involved in child welfare. Can you guys think of why that might be? Want to put anything in the chat? Any thoughts on crossover youth and why we might see more of them? Yeah, so Kristen says the lack of or trauma. And I want to emphasize that, can't emphasize that enough. Thank you for sharing that, Kristen. Yeah, the trauma that our kids experience often results or lends itself to behaviors that we don't like when it comes to acting that way in school or when it comes to acting that way in the community. And other students are talking about resources and difficulty attaining them, the cycle of violence. Other students are saying that the school to prison pipeline. Exactly. So, a child that's experienced tremendous trauma, they're acting out, they're showing up at school, they're behaving in manners that we don't think are appropriate. And instead of, talking with the child, talking with the family, we get on the phone and the police are there and the police take this child into their custody. Okay. It's incredibly common. And girls are representing more and more of these cases over time. And again, over half of the girls that are in the juvenile justice system have had contact with child welfare. And we could talk all day about the way that girls are policed and punished for behavior that we don't think is appropriate for girls to engage in. And yet there's a real growing understanding about the dynamic between child abuse and neglect, the trauma that has happened, and delinquency. And so just want to acknowledge that, especially as we talk about older kids and kids that are having a difficult time locating placements, that juvenile justice issues, delinquency, they become incredibly interwoven. And so, if you're a person that's interested in criminal justice, you're interested in law enforcement, you're interested in probation, or you're interested in, issues relating to incarceration, you must know that a number of the folks that are involved in those systems were all involved in foster care. The overlap is tremendous. Okay. And again, I want to thank everybody for engaging in the chat. Okay. With that brings me to the end of my talk, and I want to see if there's questions for about 2 minutes, and then I'm going to turn it over to David. Any questions before we turn it over? No? Okay. I want to acknowledge that that was really fast. So if you're like, whoa, that was intense, I join you in that. It was quick. One suggestion that I have for you are the ABCs of dependency, which I linked on the syllabus. That's a very thorough document that does an excellent job of outlining the process in much more detail than I just did. Okay. David, are you ready?
I am ready.
Okay. All right. I'm going to pull up your talk.
All right.
And if there's anything else I can do, let me know, but I'll see you guys in about 35, 40 minutes. And we'll give it to David for now. Okay. Thanks, David.
Yeah. Thank you, Taylor. Thanks for that really quick but thorough overview. As Taylor was saying, the child welfare system is incredibly complex, and if you're thinking about like the various issues with how it functions, there is a ton of nuance to it, in large part because of how the child welfare system overlaps with other public serving systems that we've talked about, like education, healthcare, juvenile justice, and various others. And so, yeah, this is, I have about 40 minutes to cover the issues of racism and bias in child welfare, which is not a ton of time. I want to acknowledge that in terms of this historical component, which we're going to move to shortly, I was really introduced to this history through a lecture series that was hosted by the Pritzker Center, featuring Dr. Jessica Price of the Florida Institute of Child Welfare. So I just want to acknowledge, all that I've learned from Dr. Price, as well as the Pritzker Center more generally. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about some of the work that we're doing at the Alliance in about 20 minutes or so. But before that, we're really going to explore the present and the history of racism and bias in the child welfare system, and then discuss some ongoing reform efforts. And before we dive in more thoroughly, I want to talk about language. So in my work with the Alliance, I use the terms people of color and communities of color. And those two terms, they're in quotes here on this slide, not because I don't support their usage, obviously. I'm using them in this presentation and in the work that we do. But I just think it's really important to be, I think it's just very important to be specific when you're using the term people of color, because it's such a broad umbrella. So in the context of this presentation, I'm referring specifically to the Black, Native American, and Latino families and communities that are disproportionately impacted by the child welfare system. And as I'm sure you know, there's really no broad consensus among people belonging to minority groups about, which terms they would like to use for, which terms they would like to be referred to using. For example, some people identify as Latino or Latina, some identify as Latinx, others as Hispanic. So yeah, there's still a lot of debate about language. So I just want to, acknowledge where I'm coming from with language. And I'm not saying that you should use any particular term, but these are the terms that I'm using. And, I just want to contextualize that. Next slide, please. So the history of racism and bias in the child welfare system is really complicated. And I'm not going to have the time to cover this entire history during the next 20 to 25 minutes. So I'm just going to try to touch on some historical events and realities that will really deepen your understanding of the racial inequities in the system. And so to begin with, in thinking about how the US government, both the federal government as well as the state and local governments, how they've intervened in and disrupted the lives of Black families, you really have to start with the institution of slavery. Under slavery, parents had no rights to their children, and children had no right to their parents. Family members could be separated at a moment's notice, never to see each other again. I was recently doing some research on just this topic and reading about how after the Civil War, once slavery had been abolished, there were thousands of formerly enslaved people who put notices in newspapers to try to get help in finding their lost family members. And some were able to find their family members who had been, sold to some slave owner thousands, hundreds of miles away, but most people, I imagine, were not. And so I just want to say that in terms of simple brutality, you can't quite compare slavery to today's child welfare system. And I think it's when people make that, very straightforward comparison, I don't know. I'm just not sure how helpful it is, because these are distinct things, right? Distinct institutions. But I think why it's really important to talk about the legacy of slavery in terms of the modern day racial inequities in the child welfare system is that, I imagine some of you have heard of the civil rights lawyer, Bryan Stevenson. So he did a TED Talk, I think it was back in 2012, where he was talking about how he gave a lecture in Germany, and he was talking about his work as a civil rights lawyer in helping wrongfully convicted people get off death row. And so at the end of this lecture, a woman in the crowd, she said, "We can never have the death penalty in Germany. There's no way with our history," meaning specifically the Holocaust, "there's no way with our history we could ever engage in the systematic killing of human beings." So, given the history of slavery in the United States, given that history of the separation of Black families, the fact that Black children today are disproportionately likely to be separated from their parents in the child welfare system is really troubling. Next slide, please. So after the Civil War, once slavery had been abolished, states in the South as well as the North started developing policies, laws, and practices to keep formerly enslaved people and their descendants physically and economically segregated. There were a lot of orphanages that were created to house orphans of the war, and most of these orphanages were segregated, and those for Black children had fewer resources and were focused on training children to be servants for white families. And I also want to focus on the concept of economic segregation for a second. So from the end of the Civil War until today, policymakers at all levels of government have made decisions that have left millions of Black Americans essentially stranded in neighborhoods with high concentrations of poverty. To cite just one example, you probably heard of the practice of redlining. And if you haven't heard of redlining, during the Great Depression, the federal government created an agency called the Homeowners Loan Corporation. And this agency gave ratings to city neighborhoods based on the perception of whether or not it was wise for mortgage lenders to give loans to people who want to buy property in those neighborhoods. And in this process of rating neighborhoods, the Homeowners Loan Corporation routinely gave majority Black neighborhoods the lowest rating. And today, so this is now 80 years on from, or maybe even close to more than 90 years on from when this agency was created, the gap between the Black and white home ownership rates is one of the key drivers of the racial wealth gap. And we'll get to more of these discriminatory laws and policies later, but what you should know now, and what you probably already gleaned from some of what Taylor shared earlier, was that poverty is the biggest risk factor for involvement in the child welfare system. Next slide, please. So while we're talking about the roots of racism and child welfare, it's really essential to look at the government's deliberate attempts to subvert Native American cultural and family traditions and assimilate Native children into white American culture. I haven't seen the film Dawnland. You know, that was the film that we saw the preview for at the beginning of today's session. I'm sure that film will give you a more thorough understanding of the issues I'm briefly going to cover here. So the first Indian boarding schools were founded in the 1860s by white men and women who saw it as their duty to civilize indigenous children by teaching them English, converting them to Christianity, and instilling values in them such as individualism and the importance of private property. For the first few decades of what became known as the Indian boarding school movement, these schools were located on tribal lands, but then in the 1880s, reformers thought that to truly assimilate Native children into mainstream white culture, it would be more effective to separate them from their families and place them in boarding schools that were off reservations. And in this quote that's on the slide, a journalist named Mary Annette Pember, she describes what life was like for the tens of thousands of Native American children who were sent to these institutions. She wrote, "Students were stripped of all things associated with Native life. Their long hair, a source of pride for many Native peoples, was cut short, usually into identical bowl haircuts. Students were physically punished for speaking their native languages. Contact with family and community members was discouraged or forbidden altogether." Next slide, please. Like slavery, the Indian boarding school movement was actively supported by the federal government through legislation as well as funding. But it wasn't until the early 20th century that the government took a leading role in the more formal child welfare system that primarily serves white families. Around this time, in the early 1900s, public opinion was turning against orphanages, which were seen as overly cold and institutional. At the 1909 White House Conference on the Care of Dependent Children, the attendees declared that children should not be removed from their homes except for urgent and compelling reasons, and destitution was not one of those reasons. So the reason why this quote is significant, because more than a century ago, some of the leading voices in child welfare were saying it was wrong to separate children from their parents simply because a family was living in poverty. And as Taylor said during her presentation, you know, a lot of children today, especially children of color, end up in foster care because their families are poor. And so this principle that children shouldn't be separated from their parents based on poverty, it's a bedrock principle of child welfare policy, but it's also one of the ways in which the child welfare system functions, perhaps not in the manner it should. So 25 years after that White House conference in 1909, during the Great Depression, the federal government created the Aid to Dependent Children program, later renamed Aid to Families with Dependent Children, or AFDC. This program provided direct cash aid to widowed mothers and single mothers living in poverty. This aid was supposed to help mothers take care of their children without having to work outside the home or rely on charity. So AFDC, it was mainly funded by the federal government, but states were responsible for administering the benefits. In the Jim Crow South, in the segregated South during the first half of the 20th century, child welfare agencies created rules that allowed them to arbitrarily deny benefits to Black families. For example, child welfare workers would deem a household, quote unquote, unsuitable if the worker determined that the children had been born out of wedlock or that a man who was not the children's father was living in the home. In 1960, in what became known as the Louisiana incident, Louisiana expelled 23,000 children from its welfare rolls based on the judgment that the households were, quote unquote, unsuitable. Most of these children were Black. There was a public outcry that followed this incident. And after that, the federal agency that was in charge of AFDC, the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, they instituted a rule named the Fleming Rule. It was named after Arthur Fleming, who was the secretary of the department at the time. And it said that states could not deny benefits or services, AFDC benefits or services, to families simply based on a judgment of unsuitability. Following the institution of the Fleming Rule, an increasing number of Black families were actually able to receive welfare benefits. Next slide, please. As I was saying, the Fleming Rule allowed more Black families to receive benefits, but then there were other federal reforms that quickly led to more families of color, or more children of color specifically. It led to them being placed in foster care. And as many researchers on these issues have pointed out, it doesn't seem like a coincidence that once child welfare agencies began serving more Black families, child welfare policies became more punitive. So according to the Fleming Rule and subsequent federal policy changes, state child welfare agencies could no longer ignore the needs of children living in neglectful or abusive households. Instead, child welfare workers either had to provide services to help children remain safely in the home, or recommend that children be removed from the home and placed with relatives in foster care. For the first time, states received federal funds to place children in foster care, but they weren't reimbursed by the federal government for providing in-home services to parents. So there was clearly this financial incentive to place children in foster care. And in terms of this provision of in-home services, up to that point, child welfare workers who were mostly white, in the South, they had been allowed to make these personal, often bigoted judgments about the fitness of Black parents in order to keep families off the welfare rolls. And suddenly they were being asked to provide services to help families stay together. So there's this clear tension there in between what workers had been allowed to do for so long and then what they were being asked to do now. And one problem was that a lot of the workers who decided whether a family was eligible for AFDC benefits, they weren't social workers who were trained to, provide in-home interventions to, deal with the issues that families might have been facing. So instead, these workers, they really relied on placing children in foster care, which, as I said before, was incentivized by federal policy. And also, under the new federal policies, states were required to report neglectful or abusive parents to the court system. So you had these two developments in the early 60s. You had the emphasis on removing children from the home and placing them in foster care, and also on reporting parents to the courts. And these are two things that really disproportionately impact families of color today. And I just want to mention one more development in child welfare policy during the 1960s, and that's an intensified focus on child abuse. In 1962, a pediatrician named C. Henry Kemp, he published a paper about battered child syndrome. He and his colleagues defined battered child syndrome as a clinical condition in young children who had received serious physical abuse, generally from a parent or foster parent. And this paper, it really set off a media and political hysteria over child abuse. The next year, the Federal Children's Bureau recommended that states introduce laws requiring that medical professionals report suspected abuse or neglect to a state hotline. And within 3 years of that recommendation, all 50 states in the US had some form of what became known as a mandatory reporting law. And Taylor was talking earlier about mandatory reporters, and I'm sure that many of you are also aware of mandatory reporting. Next slide, please. So there are just a few more pieces of federal legislation I want to cover here. In 1974, Congress passed the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, known as CAPTA. Under CAPTA, states had to follow certain guidelines for mandatory reporting laws in order to receive federal funding to address child abuse. So what happened in the wake of the passage of CAPTA was that states widened the net of mandatory reporters to include teachers, social workers, and law enforcement, whereas before it was just medical professionals who were mandated to report suspected child abuse or neglect. And so, not surprisingly, with the greater number of mandated reporters, there were significantly more maltreatment reports. Between 1974 and 1980, the number of maltreatment reports nationwide rose from 60,000 to 1.1 million, and the number of foster care placements rose as well. What's notable is that there was this explosion in reports, but then not a response by the federal and state governments to really invest in prevention. You know, what Taylor was talking about in terms of preventing maltreatment, as well as preventing children from being placed in foster care. And so before we move on to the next section about disproportionality and disparities today, I just want to mention another notable and important piece of child welfare legislation that was passed in the 1970s. In 1978, Congress passed the Indian Child Welfare Act, which is known as ICWA, and which I'm sure is discussed in that movie Dawnland. So the passage of ICWA came after 4 years of congressional testimony documenting the deliberate and destructive separation of Native American families by state and local child welfare agencies. During congressional testimony, it was revealed that between 25% and 35% of Native children nationwide were being separated from their parents and placed outside of their families and communities. And 80% of these children who were being separated were being placed in white households. In following with patterns I've already discussed, a lot of these children were being taken from their families simply because their families were experiencing poverty. So ICWA, was essentially designed to create strong legal safeguards against separating Native families. And with the passage of ICWA, Native parents finally won the legal right to prevent their children from being placed in off-reservation boarding schools. So I know this historical overview was really long and detailed, and I am going to pause to see if anyone has any questions. But here's what I want you to take away from all of this history is that during the 60s and 70s, the federal government, along with the state governments, they built an apparatus that was designed to surveil families, intervene in cases of suspected abuse or neglect, and separate children from their parents if those allegations were substantiated. Later federal reforms focused on moving children out of the system more quickly by providing financial incentives to states for facilitating more adoptions. And in keeping with this country's history of racial oppression and marginalization, communities of color have really borne the brunt of what can fairly be described as punitive child welfare policies. Next slide, please. So I recognize that, we don't have a ton of time left, so I'm going to try to, rush through this section a bit without missing any important content. But the data on disproportionality and disparities in child welfare are really striking. Most of you probably know this, but just to clarify terminology, disproportionality refers to a group's overrepresentation within the child welfare population compared to their overall share of compared to their share of the overall child population. And disparity refers to a difference in outcome at a certain stage of the child welfare process. For example, Black children who are alleged to have been neglected or abused are more likely to have that allegation substantiated than white children are. I'll discuss that specific disparity in more detail later. So in the country as a whole, Black children comprise 14% of all children, but 23% of children in foster care. More than half of Black children in the United States experience a child welfare investigation before the age of 18. Despite the passage of the Indian Child Welfare Act more than 40 years ago, the proportion of Native American children in foster care is 2.6 times higher than their share of the total child population. While Latino children are underrepresented in the national foster care population, they're overrepresented in more than 20 states, including California. Looking at the back end of the system, meaning how children leave foster care, children of color are less likely than white children to exit the system through reunification, adoption, or legal guardianship. And children who age out of foster care, meaning they never find a permanent home, are more likely to end up homeless or in prison. In California, as this slide says, Black children are nearly three times as likely as white children to be referred for maltreatment, more than 3 times as likely to have an allegation substantiated, and 4 times as likely to enter care. compared to white children, Native American children in California are more than twice as likely to be referred for maltreatment, 2.5 times as likely to have a maltreatment allegation substantiated, and more than 3 times as likely to enter foster care. In Los Angeles County specifically, Black children are 6 times likely to be in foster care as their white peers, and Native American children are 4 times as likely. And I want to pause here and see if anyone has any questions. I know I've thrown a lot of information at you. Not seeing any questions in the chat, so let's come back to questions later. Okay, so how can we make sense of this data on disproportionality and disparities? If you're trying to understand this data, you really have to start with the long-standing socioeconomic inequalities in the United States. As I mentioned earlier, poverty is the most significant risk factor for child welfare involvement, and certain communities of color experience much higher rates of poverty than their white peers. According to a 2020 report by the Children's Defense Fund, here are the child poverty rates in America: 30.1% for Black children, 29.1% for Native American children, 23.7% for Hispanic children, and 8.9% for white children. So children belonging to these minority groups experience poverty at 2 to 3 times the rate of white children. Again, income and wealth inequality in this country is not an accident. For centuries, as I've briefly covered in this presentation, the policymakers at all levels of government have enacted policies and also overseen practices that have limited opportunities for employment and educational attainment for communities of color. And that's not to mention inequalities in healthcare access, housing, public safety, and many other areas. While poverty is a huge risk factor for child welfare involvement, the correlation between poverty, race, and child welfare involvement is complex. According to the latest comprehensive government study of child abuse and neglect, children in low socioeconomic households experience some form of maltreatment at a rate more than 5 times the rate of other children. So does that mean that the disproportionate impacts of poverty are the sole explanation for the racial inequities in the child welfare system? Not exactly. Before low-income families of color come into contact with the child welfare system, they have frequent interactions with professionals and other public serving systems, such as social services, healthcare, education, and criminal justice. And as we discussed, these professionals are mandated to report suspicions of child abuse or neglect to state hotlines. And when those families are investigated for neglect or abuse, decades of research and personal testimonies show that the child welfare system treats families of color differently from white families. In other words, biases held by people working within the system show up in their decision-making. I just want to refer back briefly to that video that Taylor shared of that child welfare professional talking about like the whole investigative process. And some people in the chat just brought up how there's some subjectivity in how people working within the system respond to the parents they encounter. And there's been, there have been a lot of attempts to kind of examine that subjectivity and how it plays out in disparate outcomes. There was a 2008 study that looked at data in Texas, and what the study found was that after controlling for income and risk, Black children were 20% more likely than white children to be involved in cases in which services were provided, and 77% more likely than white children to be removed from their homes instead of receiving services. So what this means, and I want to highlight that part about controlling for income and risk. What this means is that a child welfare worker assessed a Black family and a white family and thought to themselves, based on their professional judgment, that the two children or the children in both households were equally likely to experience future maltreatment. But despite that judgment, they were more likely to offer services, meaning to intervene in the lives of that Black family or remove that Black child from the home. And so what this suggests is a bias in their decision-making. And I want to acknowledge that that was one study. And there have been other studies in other jurisdictions showing that there wasn't necessarily that there weren't indications of racial bias in the decision to remove, but like the fact that even this one, peer-reviewed study showed this potential impact of bias is really concerning. And I was going to talk a bit about some of the other federal social welfare policies that impact child welfare, but I'm just going to have to skip ahead in the interest of time. Next slide, please. So I've given you a lot of background information and data to digest. And now I want to talk about some of the work that we've been doing at the Alliance. Just for a bit of background, the Alliance we're based in LA. We provide direct services to children and families in the child welfare system. And we also do advocacy on the local and state level. I joined the Alliance's policy team last October to help lead our racial justice and equity project. And this project, it was really inspired by the nationwide movement that started last summer in the wake of the killings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and many others. And so the Alliance, their work has always served, primarily communities of color. The communities of color that are disproportionately impacted by the child welfare system. And what distinguishes this project, which we've named Whole Families, Whole Communities, is that it specifically focuses on strategies that are designed to address the racial inequities in the system by driving policy reforms at every stage of the child welfare process. And the vision for the Whole Families, Whole Communities initiative is that all families will have equitable access to services and supports, regardless of their socioeconomic background, race, or ethnicity. As a result, no child will be at greater risk of entering or aging out of foster care based on these characteristics. And another thing I want to acknowledge is that there have been families and activists and community-based organizations who have been working for decades in the communities that are disproportionately impacted by the child welfare system. So this isn't like a new conversation by any means. The Alliance is really, we are indebted in our work. We're indebted to the people who've been working on these issues for years. Next slide, please. So over the last 8 to 9 months, we've been collaborating with advocates, attorneys, child welfare agency staff, activists, and people directly impacted by the system to develop a set of policy recommendations to make the system more equitable and just for families and communities of color. We're going to publish a report with these recommendations in the next couple of weeks and formalize the Whole Families, Whole Communities Advocacy Coalition. And the goals of the policy recommendations are to value family and community through prevention strategies, address the power imbalance between families in the child welfare system, empower the family network and connect youth to their community, and prioritize family and community-centered pathways to reunification. In the next slides, I'm going to describe each category and provide an example of a recommendation for each one. Thank you, Taylor. The first category of recommendations focuses on valuing family and community through prevention strategies. As Taylor was talking about, and as I've discussed, existing child welfare policies and practices, they tend to focus on what's called secondary and tertiary prevention, which has more to do with responding to abuse and neglect versus actually preventing it in the first place, versus actually preventing families from coming into contact with the system. And so in some good news, the federal government recently passed, or is recently going to, sorry, it's been a long day. The federal government is soon going to implement a bill called the Family First Prevention Services Act, which will, for the first time, make federal funding available for foster care prevention. So that is some of our work around prevention will have to do with really helping influence how this legislation is implemented at the state and local level. But for the, in terms of this presentation, I really want to focus on a different recommendation that we are putting forth as it relates to preventing families from experiencing, preventing children from being placed in foster care. And that area has to do with limiting the number of removals that occur based on the statutory definition of child neglect. From 2016 to 2018, nearly 90% of first entries into foster care in California occurred under the statutory definition of neglect. What's problematic about the neglect statute is that it allows for a lot of subjectivity in determining what neglect looks like. In practice, this means that a significant number of low-income parents, and specifically parents of color, are separated from their children simply because these parents are struggling to meet their children's basic needs. And when child welfare agencies confuse poverty with neglect, they traumatize marginalized families and miss out on opportunities to provide much needed prevention services with housing, employment, healthcare, and other areas. What we're proposing as a strategy to limit removals that occur based on neglect is to raise the legal standard for these removals by revising the statute in two ways. The first would be that the court would have to find that a parent failed to meet their children's basic needs willfully and with an intent to harm. And the second would be to requiring that caseworkers provide evidence that intensive in-home services would not remedy the cause of the maltreatment allegation. Next slide, please. The next category of recommendations focuses on addressing the power imbalance in the child welfare system. And here I just really want you to think about what's at stake in a child welfare investigation. On the one side, you have this really large bureaucratic agency. As Taylor mentioned earlier, DCFS has a budget of $2 billion, which speaks to its size as an agency as well as its power. So you have DCFS on one side in the case of LA County, and then on the other side you have a parent, a family, and that it's frequently a Black mother who's dealing with the stressors of poverty and discrimination, who's been accused of either neglecting or abusing their child. And the odds are that this parent doesn't know what the child welfare process will entail or what their due process rights are in the child welfare process. There's a clear power imbalance here. And one reform that would give more power to families is to make pre-petition legal representation available to all families who are under investigation by a child welfare agency. That term pre-petition, it means before the child welfare agency has filed a petition in court to remove a child from the home. In California, if a parent can't afford legal counsel, a judge will appoint an attorney to the parent at the first court hearing. However, it's possible for a child to be removed from the home prior to the first hearing if a social worker or law enforcement determines the child is at imminent risk of harm. Pre-petition legal representation would provide parents with legal advocacy in the early stages of the child welfare process in order to keep families together and prevent children from being placed in foster care. Attorneys can help with legal issues such as applying for public benefits or assisting with affordable housing. They can also lobby for services that would help keep the child in the home, such as counseling or medical care to address the child or the parent's health needs. Next slide, please. The third category of recommendations focuses on empowering the family network and connecting youth to their community. If a child welfare agency decides it's appropriate and necessary to separate a child and parent, that agency should really take affirmative steps to keep that child connected with members of their family and their community. And one way to accomplish this is by placing the child with a relative who wants to step up as a caregiver. However, there are certain barriers in the processes to placing children with relatives. And this process is called, specifically in California, it's called resource family approval. And one barrier to these placements in the RFA process has to do with arrest or conviction records. So we know that the families and communities of color who are disproportionately impacted by the child welfare system are also those who are disproportionately impacted by the criminal justice system. So if you have a situation, as we've seen anecdotally, that Black family, for example, you have a child is separated from their parent, relative wants to step up as a caregiver, that relative has arrests from 20 years ago that really have no bearing on their fitness as a caregiver. But because of the way that RFA process works, there could be a delay in placing the child with that relative, or that relative could be denied as a caregiver altogether. So we're currently co-sponsoring legislation, Senate Bill 354, that would give the dependency court more power to place children with relatives who have certain arrests or convictions, and it would also widen the types of convictions that are eligible for exemptions. Next slide, please. And I know that we are running out of time, so luckily this is the final slide. The final category of recommendations, it focuses on prioritizing family decision-making when considering permanency and reunification. In other words, it would give families more decision-making or more power in how they choose to exit the system. And one issue we're hoping to address in this category is the accessibility of reunification services. Taylor spoke about what reunification services are. And an issue that comes up is that reunification services within a certain place, they may be limited in terms of the types of services, and also parents might have to pay for the services. And there's a clear equity issue there, because low-income families of color are disproportionately represented in the child welfare system. So if parents have to pay for services, that just adds to the stressors that they're experiencing, the other issues that they experience as people of color. So what we're calling for is for child welfare agencies to have to make sure that the services are actually accessible within all the communities and also provided free of cost to parents. So that is my presentation. So there might be some questions, and I think Taylor answered them. So thanks for your time. Sorry for jamming all that information into such a short period of time, but you can always reach out to me if you want to learn more about our work, and I'm sure that I'll partner with some of you at a later date.